Opening the central diagonal for the queen and king's bishop instantly challenges the opponent's space. Mirroring white's pawn establishes central presence, contesting crucial squares and preparing swift piece development. Developing a knight to attack the center immediately puts pressure on black's pawn and prepares castling, setting an active tone. Developing the knight to its most natural square, nc6 prepares to defend the pawn on e5 and hints at potential counterplay along the central files. Developing the bishop to this active diagonal immediately pressures black's knight, hinting at future tactical exchanges and control over central squares. Probing white's bishop, this pawn advance creates space and questions the knight's influence over crucial central squares. Sacrificing tempo for the bishop pair, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain positional freedom. Opening the d-file and centralizing the queen, though it leaves the king's pawn structure a bit exposed. Reinforcing the central pawn with knight development sets the stage for a potential kingside pawn storm or controlling crucial central squares. Fortifying the e-pawn with f6 weakens the kingside's light squares, inviting tactical incursions later. Launching a pawn thrust into the center immediately challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create weaknesses. Opening the e-file now grants black immediate central influence, but consider the compromised pawn structure on the queen side. It might become a long-term liability if not addressed through careful piece development and pressure. Recapturing the pawn with the queen immediately opens lines for counterplay, potentially at the cost of piece development, but it also secures a central pawn majority. Securing the bishop's diagonal influence towards the enemy king, this maneuver aims to activate piece play and counter white's central pawn majority. Establishing a comfortable outpost for the queen, this development efficiently defends the e3 square while preparing to castle kingside and join the central pressure. Developing the knight to e7 offers a flexible retreat square should the center become more dynamic, while also preparing to support a pawn push on d5 or f5, aiming to challenge white's central pawn control and open lines for black's pieces. Shifting the knight to d2 opens up the c-file for the queen, potentially pressuring black's doubled pawns on the c-file, while also preparing for kingside expansion with pieces like the kingside knight and bishop. Challenging the central pawn structure, this maneuver injects immediate tension and demands white's attention, potentially disrupting their piece coordination and opening up lines for an active middle game skirmish. Shifting the queen from its prior central post to d3 immediately addresses the potential diagonal pressure from black's bishop on g4 and also prepares for a possible kingside castling. This retreat, however, does concede some central space and may invite black to develop a more active pawn structure or control of key squares with their own pieces. Unleashing a pawn thrust on the queen side, black aims to seize crucial space and disrupt white's kingside development by threatening the bishop on b5. This aggressive pawn push also opens up diagonal lines for black's pieces, potentially creating dynamic counterplay. Repositioning the queen to e2 aims to free the d3 square for another piece, perhaps a knight, and prepares for potential kingside castling, while maintaining pressure on the center and keeping an eye on the c5 pawn. Expanding the pawn chain to c4 aggressively contests the center and aims to restrict white's bishop on e3, potentially creating weaknesses on the queen side as the d4 pawn is now less supported. Unleashing a sudden diagonal threat, white attempts to disrupt black's burgeoning queenside expansion and potentially expose the king's sanctuary, a bold gambit that prioritizes immediate tactical pressure over consolidating the central pawn structure. Unfolding the kingside pawn structure in this manner sacrifices the king's primary shield, creating immediate and persistent vulnerabilities that will demand vigilant defense for black, potentially allowing white an inviting target for future attacking operations. The white queen, having retreated to h6, now eyes the kingside, forcing black to solidify his king's defense further while white continues to develop pieces and prepare for an eventual assault. Relocating the monarch to a less exposed square is a prudent reaction, prioritizing king safety over immediate offensive ambitions, as the king's current position on the f-file is precariously open to further intrusion by the adversary's queen. Embarking on a pawn surge on the king side, white seeks to pry open lines for a potential attack against black's sheltered monarch, although this advance does weaken the king's own pawn shield somewhat. Steering the queen to this square aims to activate it along the f8-a3 diagonal, potentially challenging white's overextended pieces, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks and consolidate the kingside pawn structure. The repositioning of the queen to h4 aims to exploit the awkward placement of black's king and the lack of development on the queen side, while simultaneously adding pressure along the h-file and potentially creating tactical opportunities should the black king remain exposed. Re-establishing a centralized knight presence, the nc6 prepares to contest the d4 square and potentially eye the kingside, while also freeing the queen from its defensive duty on d6. Unleashing the knight to d5 immediately targets the weak pawn structure black has created by pushing pawns on the queen side and centralizing the queen. This is a bold territorial grab, aiming to dominate the d6 square and potentially disrupt black's developing pieces. Black aggressively challenges white's knight outpost, attempting to disrupt the central pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, though this venture risks overextending their own king. Unleashing a forcing check, white immediately seeks to disrupt black's already precarious kingside and exploit the compromised pawn structure. The queen's foray, coupled with the knight's strong central presence, creates significant tactical possibilities and forces black into a defensive posture, potentially revealing weaknesses. The king now retreats, seeking refuge behind a newly formed pawn shield, a crucial attempt to shore up defenses against the encroaching white queen and knight. This maneuver prioritizes immediate king safety over developing counterplay, recognizing the imminent danger on the king side. While it sacrifices tempo, the potential consequences of leaving the monarch exposed in the center were far more severe, potentially leading to a swift and decisive attack. The focus shifts from aggressive queen play to a more defensive posture, aiming to weather the storm and regroup for future action. Liberating the queen from its precarious central post signals a decisive shift towards simplifying into an endgame, where black's doubled pawns on the c-file become a significant long-term liability. Black's decision to capture the queen on f8, despite leaving their king somewhat exposed, is a pragmatic attempt to simplify the position and enter an endgame with equal material. This capture, however, comes at the cost of a weakened pawn structure, particularly on the king side, which white will likely aim to exploit. The immediate exchange of queens removes a significant attacking piece, but it also grants white a clearer path to developing their pieces and potentially creating threats against the uncastled king. The challenge for black now is to consolidate their forces and find defensive resources while white probes for weaknesses. Snatching that pawn at c7 is a bold, albeit perhaps premature, gambit that ignites immediate complications, creating a fascinating positional tug-of-war over the central dark squares, which will test black's ability to consolidate their material advantage against white's active pieces and potential for open lines down the road. Bringing the rook to the b-file immediately challenges white's exposed bishop and eyes the semi-open file for potential activity. This proactive measure aims to disrupt white's central dominance and begin untangling black's somewhat awkward piece coordination. Unveiling the king side, white strategically casts, securing the monarch and simultaneously activating the rook to an open file, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed black king and the central pawn majority. The black king is now significantly exposed, a direct consequence of that premature pawn push on the queen side. Moving the monarch again seems like a desperate attempt to escape the mounting pressure, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue of the weakened king side. This relocation of the king, while understandable given the circumstances, doesn't improve black's coordination and leaves the king as a potential target for white's attacking pieces. Swapping pieces with no tangible benefit, such as the upcoming potential exchange of queens, only serves to simplify the position for white, who enjoys a clear advantage in development and king safety. An active piece for white could soon exploit the open lines and compromised pawn structure around the black monarch. Relocating the knight to its original square feels like a strategic retreat, a reassessment of the immediate tactical battlefield. White is essentially acknowledging that the prior knight's sortie into enemy territory, while bold, didn't yield the desired decisive advantage and perhaps exposed the king slightly. Now the focus shifts to consolidating forces and preparing for a more methodical approach, aiming to leverage the open files and potentially exploit black's slightly uncoordinated queenside pawn structure. It's a move that signals a preference for solid development and positional play over immediate, risky attacks. Reinforcing the pawn chain on the kingside is a sound positional idea, aiming to secure king safety and prepare for potential pawn breaks later in the game. Pushing the pawn to e5 creates immediate central space and pressure, aiming to dislodge black's knight and potentially open lines for white's queen and rook. It also restricts the mobility of black's king's bishop. Emerging from the bishop's current bind, the knight now finds a more natural route to influence the center, eyeing potential outposts on d5 or c5. The knight's repositioning here establishes a potent central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Reclaiming the initiative, black pivots the bishop, aiming to connect its rooks and activate the minor piece from its currently passive diagonal after the white king's castling adventure. Elevating the pawn to challenge, the bishop's active diagonal offers a subtle, yet impactful, push for queenside space and potential pawn majority development. The rook's departure to g8 offers a subtle but crucial repositioning, preparing to contest the semi-open g-file and provide potential support for a pawn advance, while also untangling the king from the current cluster of pieces. The rook's relocation to the e-file now actively contests the central open file, enhancing pressure and preparing for potential pawn advancements or file occupations that could challenge black's somewhat cramped position and the king's exposed nature. The bishop's relocation to e6 aims to contest white's dominance of the central dark squares, seeking to unblock the potential for development on the kingside and prepare for future pawn advances along the c-file, creating a more balanced, albeit somewhat cramped, position for black. Unleashing a bishop to a seemingly quiet square, white aims to disrupt black's pawn chain's structural integrity and simultaneously free up the d-file for potential kingside assault pressure. Unlocking the queenside, black aims to break free from white's encroaching pawns and create dynamic counterplay, even at the cost of potentially creating weaknesses further down the line. Initiating a central pawn push, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's bishop coordination and potentially open a path for the knight to become more active. Asserting dominance on the queenside begins with the rook's deployment to the second rank, a move that simultaneously shields the king and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Opening a new avenue of attack for the queen's bishop, this repositioning aims to disrupt black's precarious pawn chain and potentially infiltrate along the newly cleared light squares. Unleashing a pawn storm onto white's castled king, this move deliberately breaks open lines, potentially sacrificing material for an assault that relies on the instability of the opposing monarch, a bold gambit to disrupt the equilibrium. Unlocking the queenside's potential hinges on disrupting black's advanced pawns, and this pawn advance precisely targets that goal, aiming to create weaknesses and open lines for your rooks. The pawn push on the queenside, 29, a5, seeks to gain space and disrupt white's potential pawn expansion while also preparing to challenge the weak c3 pawn. Relinquishing the highly active rook from the threatened d-file opens up a potential pathway for the black pieces to swarm toward the kingside. This aggressive pawn thrust seeks to immediately exploit the exposed white king and open lines for black's pieces, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing white to react defensively to prevent a rapid breakdown. Bringing the knight to d4 seizes control of a crucial central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the queenside. Finally, black challenges the advanced knight, aiming to simplify the position and perhaps gain some breathing room on the queenside. This exchange offers a chance to resolve the current pawn structure complications and steer the game towards a more manageable endgame, though White's rook on the 7th rank remains a persistent threat that needs careful consideration. Unpinning the rook creates an immediate tactical threat along the now open 7th rank, potentially forcing concessions from Black's rather passive piece coordination. Capturing the bishop on h4 is a bold, perhaps desperate, attempt to disrupt White's coordinated attack, trading off material for a glimmer of counterplay on the king side. But it leaves Black's own king precariously exposed and relinquishes valuable defensive potential. Reclaiming that rook offers a crucial opportunity to rally White's forces, aiming to stabilize the position and develop a counterplay against Black's recently liberated queen's bishop. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain now feels imperative, forcing White to confront immediate structural challenges and potentially diverting attention from their kingside pressure. The pawn chain on the queenside crumbles as White captures, opening the c-file for a potential invasion and disrupting Black's pawn structure significantly. Reactivating the bishop to a more central square offers better diagonal coverage, preparing to support a potential advance on the kingside and contest White's central pawn mass. Repositioning the knight to c2 aims to redeploy it to a more active square, likely d4 or e3, to support the e5 pawn and potentially contest control of the center. Consider the knight's future path. Can it join the queenside pressure after a potential c3 push, or will it be needed to bolster the kingside defense? Observe the precariousness of Black's pawn structure on the queenside. This knight maneuver could be the precursor to a more aggressive central thrust or a strategic repositioning to exploit weaknesses. Unleashing the g-pawn opens up crucial lines for your pieces, aiming to destabilize White's pawn shield and create immediate threats around their king, a bold gambit in a tense positional struggle. Exchanging the bishop seizes the opportunity to simplify the position when material is equal, aiming to expose Black's somewhat compromised king's safety and create immediate threats on the now open e-file. The Black king, finally free from its defensive chores, now embarks on a journey across the board, seeking active participation and potentially disrupting White's centralized pieces. Snatching the offered pawn simplifies the position dramatically, bringing White's knights into a more active central outpost while simultaneously exposing Black's unprotected queenside pawns to further pressure. Embracing the chaos and opening lines offers a chance to disrupt White's consolidated structure, but it also exposes your king to immediate danger in the ensuing tactical skirmish. Disrupting the pawn chain's integrity, the knight's aggressive leap forces an immediate response, aiming to pry open the central structure and expose Black's king further. The king scurries back into the center, a desperate attempt to find some safety amidst the exposed files and White's attacking cavalry. But the surrounding pieces offer little immediate sanctuary, hinting at potential future tactical skirmishes. A bold recapture on f4, aiming to activate the rook and challenge Black's advanced pawns, though it leaves White's king a touch more exposed in the center of the board. The rook's redeployment to g4 aims to disrupt White's pawn chain and create counterplay on the kingside, potentially targeting the now exposed g2 pawn. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file now that the rook is actively defended by its counterpart seems like a solid tactical maneuver. Unleashing the pawn chain's latent energy becomes paramount now. It's time to stir up some complications on the kingside and potentially force White to defend against threats that would otherwise go unnoticed. The knight's sudden appearance on the d8 square, forcing the Black king into a more confined position and disrupting any potential pawn advances, signifies a critical shift in the endgame's dynamics. The king's escape route now appears to be the only sanctuary, as the remaining pawns on the queenside crumble under the pressure. Slamming open the central files with knight takes knight is a daring gambit, seeking to unravel Black's king position and expose its defenses. King now exposed, the game transitions into a desperate scramble for survival, with the rooks and knight poised to exploit the vulnerable monarch's precarious position. The rook's descent to the 6th rank immediately exploits Black's exposed monarch, creating a forcing sequence that aims to dislodge the king from its sanctuary and initiate a decisive attack. The black king, exposed and vulnerable, scurries to the corner of the board, a desperate attempt to find sanctuary amongst its own beleaguered pawns. Initiating a decisive assault on the weakened black king, this rook maneuver creates immediate threats and forces black to defend reactively. Relinquishing the open file allows the rook to penetrate, but it leaves your king exposed on the dark squares and creates a potential weakness for the pawn structure. Initiating a counterattack on the exposed kingside by bringing the rook from the f-file into the fray to pressure the e-pawn. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file, black aims to activate their rook and potentially create an exchange sacrifice opportunity to disrupt white's connected passed pawns, a crucial endgame consideration. The white rook liberates itself from its pinned position, initiating a decisive attempt to overwhelm black's exposed king. The black king, having endured a lengthy trek across the board, now finds itself in a precarious central position, a prime target for the remaining pieces. The rook's forceful advance to h6 creates an immediate threat to the black king, forcing a defensive reaction and potentially opening lines for further attack as the position simplifies towards an endgame. The monarch, having shuffled across the battlefield, now seeks refuge near its allied pawns, hoping to fortify its position. The rook swings over to support the pawn's advance, a crucial piece of coordination in this complex endgame, aiming to break through the enemy defenses and simplify the position in white's favor. Seeking refuge from the relentless pressure, black's king attempts to consolidate on a slightly safer square, a necessary step as the board simplifies. Initiating a forced king march, this check aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create mating opportunities or win material by exposing the black monarch further. Stepping back from the brink, black attempts to consolidate their king's position amidst this chaotic endgame, seeking a sanctuary from the relentless knight and rook pressure that has been dismantling their defenses. Repositioning the rook to the 8th rank sets up a decisive pressure along that open file, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed king and create mating threats. Seeking to capitalize on the open d-file and the exposed white king, the rook advances, ready to participate in the imminent exchange or to apply pressure along the 7th rank. Opening up the king's diagonal allows for aggressive advances against black's weakened pawn structure. This audacious capture, seizing the rook, immediately introduces a tactical explosion, forcing a cascade of exchanges and simplifying the position into a potential queen and pawn endgame where white's passed pawn on the 7th rank becomes a significant threat. A devastating check that cripples the opponent's already precarious pawn structure, opening a decisive pathway to victory. The black king, desperately seeking refuge, now finds itself exposed on the open board, a juicy target for the advancing white pieces. Bringing the rook back into the fray redirects pressure toward that vulnerable d4 pawn, aiming to exploit the piece coordination black still lacks. Exchanging that rook decisively simplifies the position, initiating the final endgame stages where the material imbalance will likely decide the outcome, transforming the board into a more tactical, yet materially decisive, contest. White seizes the opportunity to simplify into a winning rook and pawn endgame by capturing the pawn. That pawn check forces a king retreat, consolidating the rook's position and setting up a decisive endgame advantage. The rook's descent to the 2nd rank initiates a forced sequence, aiming to simplify the position by eliminating the pesky passed pawn and consolidating the material advantage before the opposing monarch can become too active. The rook now occupies a crucial outpost, a testament to the maneuvering that has secured this square, forcing white to reconsider their defensive setup. The rook slides across the 6th rank, solidifying control of the open file and preparing to join the attack on the exposed black king. The rook swings over to join the attack on the exposed kingside, aiming to exploit the open file and create immediate threats against white's vulnerable monarch. Initiating the recapture with the king opens up avenues for piece activity and prepares to consolidate the material advantage gained from the exchange. Black's rook now actively targets the g4 square, reinforcing the pawn chain and eyeing potential breakthroughs while keeping pressure on White's isolated rook. Solidifying that pawn chain offers the rook a potential outpost on the third rank, preparing to assert dominance over the open files. The black rook now seeks active participation on the open files, a much-needed initiative to stir the stagnant position after White's rook's journey. Sharpening the attack, the rook checks the enemy king, forcing it to a less secure square and setting up further pressure. The black king, finding itself exposed on the queen side, must now actively seek safety by repositioning towards the center, a crucial step as the pawn structure collapses and open lines beckon for the opposing forces. The king ventures out, a bold dash for the queen side as the rook prepares to escort it towards potentially safer squares. Shifting the rook to the side now prepares to block any potential infiltration attempts by White's remaining rook, and also aims to support the pawn advance from the queen side, creating a more solid defensive structure. Initiating a slow squeeze on the queen side, the rook endeavors to secure dominance over the b-file, preparing to peel off and support the advancing pawns or join the attack on the black king's defenses. A desperate attempt to exploit the open diagonal for the queen and potentially create mating threats, but it ignores the immediate material deficit and the well-protected white king, leaving black's own monarch exposed to further attack. Clearing a path for the king to join the fray, this pawn thrust creates a dynamic fork, forcing a difficult decision for black's rook and potentially opening up devastating lines of attack. The rook's migration to the queen side, shadowing the advancing pawn, aims to disrupt the white king's defensive structure and create counterplay along the newly opened ranks. The king ventures out from its corner, aiming to solidify its central presence and support the advancing pawns. Pushing the king closer to the action, aiming to support the rook and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. The white king bravely ventures into enemy territory, aiming to solidify the pawn structure and potentially support a breakthrough on the queen side. The monarch is finally seeking refuge from the encroaching enemy pieces, desperately trying to consolidate its position behind the pawn wall. Harnessing the open file to pressure the enemy king's sanctuary, the rook slides across to threaten the pawn chain. The pawn push to e5 has opened a dangerous path for the white rook, threatening immediate material gain. Unleashing a tempo-gaining pawn thrust, White aims to dislodge the enemy king further, leveraging the open files for potential attack and exploiting Black's exposed monarch. A desperate attempt to solidify the king's position, but it opens a dangerous path for White's remaining pieces. The king bravely ventures forward, a bold centralizing maneuver aiming to dominate the remaining open squares and support the pawn storm's advance. The king, finally escaping the oppressive pressure of the rooks, now seeks sanctuary on the open queen side, aiming to rejoin the fray and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. The rook now shifts to the king's side, creating a defensive wall and supporting potential pawn pushes while keeping an eye on the central squares. Releasing the rooks to harass the enemy monarch offers a dynamic shift, turning a potentially stagnant endgame into a battlefield of potential checks and tactical exchanges. Seizing the central pawn is paramount. Its capture forces Black's king to choose between remaining vulnerable or committing to a dangerous advance. Navigating the chessboard's final frontier, Black chooses to redirect the rook's potential, a subtle shift aiming to exploit the exposed white king. Initiating a forceful central advance with the rook to threaten the isolated black pawn, aiming to seize the initiative and open up attacking lines. Snatching that pawn opens up the king's final defense, leaving it exposed on the exposed queen side. Initiating a final, decisive check that will eliminate Black's last pawn and pave the way for an unstoppable king march. The king finds a momentary haven, but the rook's pressure on the flank is relentless, forcing a difficult decision about which pawn structure to defend. Pushing the g-pawn now opens a path for the king to become an active participant in the endgame, potentially creating a protected passed pawn. The kingside pawns are finally being unified and activated, aiming to disrupt White's centralized king and potentially create mating threats or force concessions. Unleashing a pawn storm toward the enemy king offers a dynamic approach to break down the defenses in this endgame. The king's exposed position on the g-file now becomes a significant liability as black's rook infiltrates to g1, threatening to create immediate mating nets or devastating pawn pushes that shatter white's defensive structure and expose the monarch further. The king's active involvement in this endgame is crucial for securing the remaining pawns and forcing a favorable outcome. Pushing the king forward here, 74. Key 4 seems to embrace the chaos, aiming to support the rook's advance and potentially create counterplay in the center where white's king feels relatively safe. Safeguarding the king by stepping into the open allows for the potential activation of the rook on the adjacent file. A remarkable defensive maneuver, seeking refuge and hoping to activate the rook by bringing it to the far side of the board, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn push and potentially create counterplay. The pawn advances, an aggressive spearhead seeking to disrupt the enemy's defensive structure and open lines for the rook. The rook now tucks itself away, a defensive maneuver that subtly repositions the defender for a potential counter-initiative on the kingside, eyeing the pawn structure that white has so painstakingly advanced. The white rook checks the black king, forcing it to move and potentially creating a mating net or a decisive material gain by isolating the king from its defenders. The rook's triumphant return to the 7th rank forces the black king into an even more precarious position, a stark reminder of how quickly defensive fortifications can crumble when the monarch is exposed. The king's exposed position is now the primary target, with the rook poised to exploit the open rank and pressure of vulnerable monarch.